Hola! Hello to our four experts from Ecuador, and welcome to our audience for joining us today on Rebuilding Tourism, a case study on Ecuador. From today's discussion, we have the four experts who are going to discuss issues concerning tourism planning, tourism policy, governance, and small tourism businesses in crisis, and how stakeholders can work together to rebuild tourism in Ecuador. Let me introduce you to them. Our first speaker is Professor Jose Gabriel Castillo. He's the director of Cenemónica Research at Ecuador Escuela Politécnica del Litoral, ESPOL. Hola, Jose.
Good morning, Professor Wickens.
Yes, good morning to you, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, good morning here. That's true.
Yeah. Welcome to the webinar. Jose, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So I am director of the Center for Economic Research in the Escuela Superior Politécnica Litoral, that it's ESPOL Polytechnic School in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And I direct also the Laboratory for Experimental Economics in the university.
Thank you, Jose. Our second speaker is Cindy Benquimilla, an entrepreneur and consultant for the travel industry in Guayaquil. Hello, Cindy.
Hello, Eugenia. Thanks for the invitation.
Welcome to our webinar series here. Please briefly introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you. I am a professional in tourism. I have been working in the sector for more than 20 years, and I have been working as a teacher, as a consultant, and well, as an entrepreneur too.
Okay, thank you very much, Cindy. Welcome to the webinar. And our third speaker is Dr. Carla Valeria Ricuarte Quijano. She's the Dean of Postgraduate Studies at the Escuela Superior Politécnica del Litoral. Hola, Carla. How are you?
We are delighted to be here. Thank you for having us.
Oh, you're welcome. And could you please just introduce briefly to the audience?
Well, I am part of the Marine and Coastal Tourism Research Group at ESPOL, at our university, and I'm interested in tourism planning and policy, and especially about, in themes of equality in tourism planning and policy. Thank you
very much, Carla. Welcome to our webinar. And our fourth speaker is Dr. Matthias Pecot. Now, he's the director of the Coastal Marine Tourism Research Group at the Escuela Superior Politécnica del Litoral, ESPOL, and he's based in Guayaquil. Hola, Matthias.
Hola, hi everyone. My name is Matthias. I'm a senior lecturer in ESPOL. I've been living in Ecuador for 12 years. My research interests encompass cities of the global south and informality. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, thank you. And welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
It's our pleasure as well to host all of you. Just a little reminder, this is for the audience now, that at the end of the presentations, we will do again the Q&A with our experts. If you would like to submit a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We will do our very best to answer as many questions as possible in the time provided. Our first speaker is Professor Jose Gabriel Castillo, who will now open the discussion on rebuilding tourism in Ecuador. Over to you, Jose.
Thank you very much, Professor Wiggins. So just confirm if you can see my slides once I upload it. Okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. So thank you for this webinar and for the audience. I should say, though, although the presentation was very generous from Professor Wickens, I'm no expert in tourism. My work is basically more related to economics in general cases. But I'm going to summarize some work that we've done recently. Basically, we are interested in the phenomena of this demand contraction in the country and what are the consequences it has in many productive sectors. And of course, one of the most affected ones is the sector of tourism, entertainment, bars, restaurants, and food services, right? So we're trying to understand how it works. But first of all, let me give you a couple of ideas related to the topic. So what are the measures that have been taken in general, right, in the world related to this pandemic as a response? So basically, the nature of the response has some economic consequences that are very, very sensible. Most of them have been on the travel restrictions, travelers monitoring, flight bans and closure in public transportation services, border closures, social distancing in public spaces, and total or partial quarantine, confinement, lockdown, or curfew, right? These are overall the measures that almost every country has had to fight the pandemic. Now, as policy responses, right, in developing countries, they tend to be weak and slow, right? And except for some very remarkable exceptions from countries that have been able to save some money or have some fiscal space, for the most part, at least that is true for Ecuador, this has been the most critical challenge. And of course, this has some consequences in terms of labor markets, right? Restrictive labor regulation that some countries have, specifically in Ecuador, for the formal sector, bring some challenges to the entrepreneurs and firms in order to adapt to these new conditions. There are challenges also in terms of cash flow and working capital, right? That small and medium firms tend to suffer in this period. Of course, this also has to do with the business model that these companies have, because probably we haven't seen many companies being conservative enough to save some of those revenues, right? In terms of having some private reserves that are, enable them to fight periods like this. There are also, of course, some credit constraints. Interest rates, at least in Ecuador, are really hard to move. They basically keep to the ceiling that is the formal interest rate ceiling that we have in the country. Of course, when the risk is higher, right, banks tend to contract their credit offering, so that also brings some challenges to the table. And the fiscal responses tend to be in this environment. They are either tax reliefs, right, tax deferrals that we have, stimulus packages that have been very slow in countries, in developing countries, specifically in Ecuador, because, as I said, this is not a country with fiscal space. So the last measures that have been taken on this topic are related mostly to new or fresh funds that come from the multilateral organisms to the country, right? And this is not a way of endogenously generating this money to help some of these businesses. And the liquidity mechanisms are also important, right? So the way the liquidity works in a country that has dollars, right, as the formal currency, is a completely different environment from just any other country that are able to use monetary policy as a response. And they basically, to put things simple, they basically can print money, right, in order to improve the demand, right? So, of course, this means lower demand, and there is the big challenge nowadays, that is, we need to think of a new business model not just for the tourist sector, but probably for most of the economic sectors, at least for the short and medium term. Now, the results that we have in the tourist sector in terms of the world are largely dependent on what are the dates to reopen the economy, right? And as you can see, there are some exercises to simulate how this will work. The gradual opening of borders would mean, for example, in a scenario with a lower sales of minus 58%, this would mean that probably by the end of December, the economy would be on the recovery track. And of course, if this gets worse, the recovery is going to be slower. That most macroeconomists have been talking about this in terms of the V-shaped recovery, right, or the U-shaped recovery. In the economic sector, it depends really on what are the dates to reopen the borders and lift the travel restrictions that we have. So the likely impact that we have is a loss of on demand, specifically international travel, and this can translate basically in a loss of the level of 850 million to 1.1 billion international tourists, the loss of 910 billion to 1.2 trillion in export revenues from tourism, and 100 to 120 million direct tourism jobs that are at risk on these conditions. Now, what does the world expect in terms of the recovery? There is a survey that was run by the United Nations World Travel Organization, and they basically ask, when do you expect international demand for your destination will start to recover? And one of the interesting facts is that, of course, countries in Africa and the Americas are probably the more pessimistic in terms of when this recovery will happen. And we are basically putting all our money on 2021, right? We would expect the recovery to be very, very slow. Now, in terms of the region, right? In terms of the Latin American region, tourist arrivals are expected to fall, right? And by 2020, probably 20 or 30%. Now, this effect is going to be felt more on these small island developing states, right? They are in the Caribbean. And as you can see, it's because most of the economy, there are some cases with like 50% or even 80% of the employment of these countries is related to the tourist sector. So the level of importance, right, in terms of the general economic conditions are really important in these Caribbean countries. In the case of Ecuador, it's a below average, I would say, in terms of the economy country for this sector. Now, the sector itself represents around 2% of the country's GDP. Of course, if we relate more of the rest of the, there you go. If we relate this to the rest of the activities that are related to the tourist sector, this would rise up to 6%, right? or around 6%. Now, as I said, in a country that has dollars, as is the case of Ecuador, the net inflow of international currency, it's really important, right? And the tourist sector is one sector that actually brings fresh money, right, to the country. Now, 8% of the export revenues are generated in the sector, but more importantly, around 1/3 of the international reserves of the country, right, come from transactions that are related to the tourist sector or entertainment for all these tourist services. Now, in general, the economy of a country like Ecuador has been slowing down from actually a period of around 3 years now, right? There are some cases that are actually that have affected the economy that are related to even some strikes that we have when the government wanted to lift the oil subsidies that we have in the country. This basically meant by the fourth quarter of 2019, this meant around 20 days of a completely stop down, right, for most of the economic activity in the country. And this, of course, had some very important conditions that are going to be felt in the general economic sector. Now, just to see how this would happen now in the first quarter of 2020, right, when we have to fight the COVID, and we also have to fight the economic consequences of the measures to fight the pandemic. We made a couple of studies that I'm going to show you briefly some of the results that are related specifically to the bars, restaurants, entertainment sector in the Guayas province. So just to say, Guayas province, where actually Espol is and Guayaquil is the main city, it's very important in terms of the sector, right? Around 33%, 1/3 of the national economic activity or sales related to these sectors are related to activities in this province, right? And as you can see, this is actually Guayas in terms of the rest of the country. Now, sales by up to 2019, they have been rising up, right, steadily, especially for bars and restaurants. Not so much for entertainment. There are some policies that have stopped this sector, although it is also true that informality is important in this sector. So a lot of informal businesses have grown up, and of course they are not going to appear on the official information. Now, it's also around the same for hotels. In terms of the employment, and this is an important part of this study, the entertainment, hotel, restaurants, bar sector registered approximately 1,018, 5,263, and 2,917 formal direct employees on these three sectors. Now, as I said, informality is really important in this country, and being conservative in some of the measures for each formal job in the tourist sector, we could probably expect around 12 to 15 additional jobs that are on the informal part. And this is more or less what has been going on in this sector, right? So in terms of total profits, for almost the three of them, right? It is for the entertainment sector, restaurants and bars and restaurants and hotels. Sales have been rising up to 2019. Now, one important issue related to these businesses, it's also tax collection, right? And the blue dots that you see on these graphs are around the millions that we have collected related to this economic activity. And they have also been rising up in general, right? Except for 2016, when the hotels sector suffered a structural break, basically related to the earthquake that was in the country. And of course, both profits and taxes have been contracted on this specific year. Now, when one looks at these data, we have to keep in mind that what we see in terms of sales or net revenue from all these businesses are related to a big value chain that has to be taken into account when analyzing the tourist sector, right? So what you have now on your screens is basically what are the local purchases, right? Or the evolution that we have on the local purchases for all these three sectors, right? And this is just to give you an idea. Say if we have under the entertainment sector for 2019, $9.8 million, right, in total sales, we have, right, more than 200% in terms of what actually this sector to generate those sales has to buy in terms of the rest of the economy, right? So this is the intermediate consumption. So this is to say the tourist sector has to be analyzed in terms of the total value chain to actually bring their real weight in terms of the economic activity, right? Now, we made some scenarios related to 2020 and how 2020 is going to end, depending on what the actual contraction of the sector would be, right? And what you have on your screen, so for example, take figure 12, the total aggregate sales of the analysis, right, that we are doing here from 2011 to 2020, if we allow for a 70% loss, right, of the operability of the general sector, we should expect the sales to drop from 850 million, right, in the province, to around 255 million. Right? And this is an important. This has an important impact, not just in terms of the aggregate demand, but also in terms of the labor market that is related to the sector. And as I said, in terms of the informal economic activity that relates to all these activities. So that's the first thing we did. And the next that I'm going to show you is actually going deeper in terms of what has happened in some of these businesses, right? And what we did is we did a survey to analyze the impact and perspectives that the sector of bars and restaurants, that is probably one of the most affected, but it's also the case that is one of these sectors that are able to adapt in some ways to new business models, right? Of course, not everyone's going to survive in that process, but it is important to analyze what their expectations are. So we did this small sample, but I would say this is probably, it is a very specific sample of managers and owners of bars and restaurants in the city of Guayaquil and San Borondón. 60% of them belong to restaurants, and the rest of the distribution is on your screen. Now, 57% of them have been in business for more than 2 years, right? And this is just to say these are stable businesses, right? And 65 of them are family businesses, and that has also some important issues to deal with in terms of the business model. Now, what we wanted to see here is what is the cost structure that all these businesses have. And as you can see on these 3 bars, human resources, right? The general rent that they have to pay for all these establishments and commercial places that they keep, and the inputs and raw material, right? They account for around 60% of the total activity, right, on this sector. The rest, marketing and publicity, commercial and production, utilities, financial services, transportation, fuels, and the rest of them, they are probably going to be related to the first measures that all these businesses are going to take in terms of contracting their business model, right? So the management strategy that they are going to implement has impact, right, on some important measures. Now, it is also the case that their perspective almost coincides with what we saw in terms of that survey from the international, right, or the world perspective. For the most part, around 60% of them, right, expect that the recovery for their revenue will take more than 6 months. And that is to say, again, that the economic sector is expecting the recovery to happen in 2021, right? So almost for 2020, even though we're in the middle of the year, most businesses expect just to survive and not even take revenues, right? So around 20% of them think it is not likely that they will continue in business, right? And this is important in terms of what the impact is going to be on this sector. Now, of course, we have to take into account that this data was collected in April, right? So expectations have likely changed since then, right? There might be some of these businesses that switch to the new business model for house deliveries, right? And probably they have changed their expectations. But it's also the case that for some of them, they have also realized probably that their business model is not able to adapt to these new conditions, and probably challenges are going to be stronger. Now, what are the most, I would say, the most common strategies or management strategies that they have implemented, regardless of their convenience in terms of the business or the economy? 61% of them have implemented some sort of staff reduction, right? And that's probably main strategy that some of these businesses have, and that has important effects in the labor market, right? 60% of them have obtained new credits, and the source of this funding is also important, because the source of this funding is not necessarily the formal financial services, but it's also the case that they would get family loans or some sort of shark loans too, right? And these can affect in the medium run what the conditions are going to be. And of course, for around half of them, they have implemented some sort of debt refinancing. Now, this is just to give you a picture of what's been going on in terms of these economic sectors in Ecuador. Now, things that I think are important to think about in terms of tourism in developing countries, right, is what are the effects in the long run that this pandemic is going to have in terms of the economic sector and in terms of the business model, right? Now, one of the issues that worries me the most is the tendency towards informal markets, right? So businesses and labor certainly are going to switch probably to some sort of informality, not just because the business model needs to adapt, but also because they probably want, in order to keep some revenue, they want to hide part of their revenue from the state or from the tax collection services. It's also the case that local or national tourism will exceed international tourism, right? So this means a different revenue because the source is now local. And of course, this also means different expectations in terms of in the long run, right? Now, the new business model probably is going to be locally oriented, right? They're going to look for alternative transaction mechanisms. And this is to say that it's not rare that we're going to find in the rural sectors, in particular, new mechanisms like bartering, that it's called trueque in the Spanish world, or for example, initiatives that are related to time bank, which is to say they share the services that some people can give in terms of getting some different services, and the unit of measure is time instead of money, right? Of course, the value chain probably are going to be integrated, or this is going to be a new model. Instead of having different sectors, they are going to try to integrate the value chain in order to control the supply of their products. And it might be also the case that some of these businesses are going to switch to what is called sustainable or social tourism as an alternative, right? Because the commercial sector for these businesses was related mostly to international tourism or international demand. Now, of course, this has some consequences in terms of inequality, because the businesses that are able to adapt to this new business model are going to be different in the urban area than in the rural area. And of course, those that were exposed for the most for the international demand. And as I said, one of the main challenges of the developing countries is related to poverty, and certainly we are trying to understand what is going to be the extent of the pandemic in terms of how this is going to affect the well-being of citizens in the country. So that's all I wanted to show you, and I'm very, very glad I had this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm open to some questions or any comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation of the economic consequences of COVID-19 on developing countries, of course, like Ecuador. In a very thoughtful, provoking, actually, presentation. And now we have got Cinti, yes?
Yes, yes, I am here.
Yes, hello. Over to you, Cinti.
Okay, thank you, Eugenia. Let me post the presentation. Okay, I think, can you see my
Yes,
presentation now?
very well. Thank you.
Okay. First, thanks, Eugenia, for the invitation. Actually, it's an honor to have this space to share with you and with your audience the experience that we are having as a part of the tourist sector in Guayaquil. So, well, I will talk about the experience of being small businesses in this crisis in our city. We as a group, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how this exercise of creating this document started. So we were concerned as academic, we were concerned about the impacts that the coronavirus will have in the tourist sector in Guayaquil. So as we are part of the training process of the future professionals, we had the compromise to contribute somehow to the sector. So we were conscious that there was no background, there was no experience about we are dealing now. So we think that this is a great opportunity to start creating new knowledge. All this exercise start with the information and recommendations that the trained group had. So we took them and we start analyzing them and putting these recommendations in our reality in Guayaquil, local reality. So as a result, we had this document, the 150 proposals of actions for destinations, enterprises, and professionals looking forward the regeneration of tourism in a time of crisis. So this document have two main objectives, 3 periods of actions, 3 levels of planning and management, and 6 strategic fields of action. So the main objective, the first one is we see this well, it is necessary to consider that we are part of the generating these new capacities for the sector. So we have to provide information to the stakeholders, or information that help them to make decisions. And the second objective was to establish, we know that we are starting from zero now. All the tourists that we know before, the sector that we knew before, is not there anymore. So this is an opportunity to create something new. So to establish an ethical and environmental model to start building, in this case, more level, more equitable society, or more equitable sector that will be where the tourism and the community will feel identified with. The 3 periods of actions that we mentioned in the document are, well, we have recommendations during the crisis, we have recommendations after the crisis, and what we should do if we have a crisis in the future. The 3 levels of planning and management, we consider the realities of destinations. So are some proposals for management of destinations, as well as the enterprises and the independent and employed professionals in the tourist sector. The 6 strategic fields of actions are administrative and financial capacities, tourist employment, biosecurity, social and environmental responsibility, tourism governance and policies, and marketing and public relationships. Okay, sorry, I have a problem with the presentation. Okay, and now just to telling you all this document, the idea is that helps the sector in a moment that no one knows what will happen. So we have seen that many enterprises are still in shock, and there's a lot of anxiety. They don't know what will happen. They don't know how to react. They keep thinking in a short-term in the short term, they have a short-term vision. They are very concerned about the day by day, about where to buy supplies, about how to pay the employees, how to pay the rent, and they are not having this medium or large vision. The lack of adaptation to change is something very obvious in this time. Well, I have some pictures here, and I have many more of businesses that are just closed because they couldn't survive. They couldn't adapt to changes, and they're still thinking that everything will happen magically, will back again to what happened and what was before the crisis suddenly. So it's not happening, and they are not having more option that just close the business. There's a lot of empirism and lack of research and refusal to self-educate. So this is a challenge for us as academic, because we developed this document to try to help the sector, but we have seen that they are not receiving they receive information, but they are not used to read, so they are not checking as we were expecting the recommendations or the proposals. The lack of coordination and this unity in the sector was very evident when the crisis started. There was feelings of abandonment, and well, this actually was one of the causes that helped to create this new association of restaurants in Guayaquil that they just created 2 weeks ago. So it's new because they didn't feel that they were represented for the other leaders of the private sector. By other hand, there's no easy access to loans or credits, not from a private banks, not from a public banks. But something that shocks us is that there's no option to have financial aid, but the government gave the private sector policies that are employers against employees. So as Jose said, at this moment, it's easier to fire people than to start fighting to keep the business working. So the case of a study that we used to make like a checklist of the recommendations is my business is La Cafetera Naranja. This is a family business, a small company. We have 6 years in the market. Before the crisis, we had 13 employees. And there was a crisis in October that helped us to see that we should start diversifying our offer. So we start working harder with the catering business. So we have these two lines of business. The coffee shop before the crisis represented the 30% of the sales, and the catering the 70% of the sales. By now, as you can imagine, well, the sales of the coffee shop are in zero, and the catering keeps working, but it's just we could say 50% of the income that we used to have before. The organization, with all the restrictions that we have had for the quarantine, the organization and management and control has been exclusively digital. So that has been another challenge for us. Okay, this is a timeline of the crisis in our business. As you can see, there's the well, when we all this challenge start with the declaration of national emergency in March 11th. And since then, just 4 days later, there was the curfew. And we received the notifications from our clients, the catering clients, saying that they were just suspending the contracts, and they had no idea when they will be working again. So we checked the numbers, and we have to make a very, very hard decision at that moment. That was scale down the personnel. We had no option. We were just starting 2 new contracts in catering, so that had less than 3 months. So we should suspend these people, our employees, and keep those that had more time with us and had more experience. So what we did is start working with them and reorganizing the company, and checking the schedules, checking time, reducing time of work, and see how we could help each other. Yeah, we as our owners, and they as employees. So far we are doing fine with that. The coffee shop, we were thinking about the option of delivery. We took 5 weeks to decide to go on that way. When we did, we realized that it was not as easy as we thought. The people that were supposed to work with us in the delivery, they didn't take the work seriously. So we had complaints of the customers, and we decided just to have a small area for delivery. And we decided to start working with the promotion of the catering. So because that has been our biggest income. So we work on a biosecurity protocol before actually the government present their proposal. And we start making promotions with our current clients and potential clients, presenting this protocol that we have, and showing that we are working in this way, and that we have all these recommendations. We are applying all these. So during this period, we have tried to access to credit, to private credit, as I said. Was rejected, and the reason was because they said that they were just helping big companies, and according to them, there was more jobs. So just big companies or strategic areas that they considered by that time, that was importing medical supplies, that was helping plastic companies produce plastic, and to help toilet paper companies. That was they told us, so we were shocked, and we knew that that was not an option for us. So we just keep finding ways. And recently, the government present another program to help small businesses, because they did this before. They did this maybe 2 months ago, and we tried, we applied, and was not possible because we were not big enough. Again, they were expecting to help, they said small businesses, but actually were businesses that had more than $1 million of sales. So that was not a reality in our city, that not for small businesses. So now they present a new proposal of credit. So we are checking on that, and well, we are expecting to see if it is possible to apply to that. The key aspects for sustainability that we consider that has been important for us as a business is that we have been very attentive to the information. We have checking all the time. We are researching. We're checking information that is generated for the government, for the academia. We are checking trends, and all the information that we can have, we are analyzing and seeing how we can use that, for our company. The resilience has been characteristic that for us is crucial to define if we will be in the business in the future or no. Quick adaptation to changes is essential. Planning for the future, not just for for the day by day. Another aspect that we realize now in this crisis is that the customer is changing. The customer now is has more empathy. They support the small businesses more than before, and the sincere communication with them has been a key for us. Cooperation with other business is important as well. We are part of this restaurant association, and they have given us help with information and even with legal support. So it is important. And the support of the family and friends, not just, well, this is a family business, as I said before, and the family has been very important. My siblings are supporting the business all the time, but it's not just the emotional support, is the support in promotion, the support in consumption even. And well, finally, we are attentive, as I said, for offers of the government, because we need, will be perfect to have this aid because we need more liquidity. But if we don't have it, we are not expecting, we won't depend on that. We already make our numbers and we will recover just according to what Jose said in 6 months. So it will take us time, but we will be fine. And it's because of the decisions that we have making and the decisions that are actually in the document that I already mentioned to you and that you can check online too. So, well, that's it for us. It's a day-by-day work. We know that we are fighting now to survive, but we have information and we have the decision to keep in business. And I hope that somehow this experience that we have is useful for other businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting, very knowledgeable on small businesses in tourism. And now our third presenter is Dr. Carla Riquata.
Hello.
Hello, Carla. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. Just trying to share, but it seems my PowerPoint is not on presentation. Okay, is that right?
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, after the interventions of Jose Gabriel, which is macroeconomic and then some microeconomic insights, and Cinti, who talked about her experience as a small business, I would like to talk to you about tourism policy making in critical times and how the tourism COVID crisis it's developing in Ecuador. First of all, I would like to start with some thoughts about what we as academics have been reading lately. And well, we have, you can see there are 3 papers that have been interesting and are in the background of this presentation. And this is an opportunity for tourism policy making in the whole world, how these major crises can help us think about tourism, can help us to stop, because we have stopped, and would help us think about how tourism could be in the future. How could we transform the tourism world for good, and how we should start thinking again about tourists as hosts and not just consumers. Then we have, I'm very sorry, somehow I have the wrong presentation here. Is this the one? I'm very sorry.
That's fine, your presentation, yeah. That's it.
No, it seems I am having some problems because this is not the right one.
No,
I
this
had,
is fine now. We can see it. You've got some pictures here. The BBC News and the Guardian, and as bodies accumulate, so do fears of a high coronavirus toll in Ecuador.
okay, well, and this is just to talk about something that Jose Gabriel mentioned before. We are a country dependent on oil, shrimp, and banana. And as Jose Gabriel said, tourism is 2% of our economy. However, what happened is in Ecuador is that tourism is the data about tourism is not it's not complete, because as Jose Gabriel said, it might be 2% of the economy, but that's just for formal businesses. Small businesses can be as much as 55%. Informal businesses can be as much as 55%, and of tourism businesses in some destinations. That means that what we have in Ecuador is an alternative economy based on self-employment, and that is not registered or not considered formal for the tourism ministry. That means that when we make public policy, we should consider both, the formal economy of tourism and this massive informal economy as well. What we have in tourism, as I said, in the informal economy is associations, more than registry. And we have tourism organizations, and in the highlands, what we have is cooperatives. When the tourism crisis struck in Ecuador, what we had in the international news is what you can see there. This is the New York Times, the BBC News, and the Guardian, all talking about Ecuador and Guayaquil in terms of the crisis, and the lines of the newspapers would call us the Wuhan of Latin America. They would present cardboard coffins, bodies on the streets, virus ravaged city. And this meant that, of course, our tourism stopped, but we also have an image destination problem now. So we were defined or described in terms of war and chaos. What happened, or what do we think that happened? Because the virus took hold first in Guayaquil, the city we live in. And what you can see there is a picture of, this is an encebollado. This is a traditional soup made of tuna that nobody prepares at home, but this is eaten on picanterias. That is very small and often informal restaurants that are right on the street. Nobody cooks an encebollado. It is way cheaper to go to the street and buy it. Guayaquileños try to understand or make sense of all this chaos through popular culture, and by saying that because of the encebollado needs to be eaten on the streets, and that our culture gets performed and reproduced on the street, we cannot stay at home, and that's how we get the virus. So there was a lot of memes on social media talking about that we got contagious because of our popular culture. We have football tournaments on the streets, and our social lives are on the street. So how is the public sector responding to all of this? Of course, tourism in Ecuador plummeted like everywhere else in the world. So my presentation is about public response and public policy in tourism in Ecuador in the face of the COVID crisis. And I would like to highlight the contrast as an academic that I see about, between what is being talked about globally, about this being an opportunity for tourism transformation, and that what is actually happening in public policy in Ecuador. So what I did for this presentation was to analyze posts on Twitter and Facebook from the tourism ministry and the main destination management organizations of the main tourism destinations and main cities such as Tourism Guayaquil, Riobamba, and Cuenca. Of course, this is not a comprehensive study, but it gives us a clear idea of what's going on. So what happened first? Well, what we had was, the first response were webinars. When we were sent home, webinars were a way to meet each other and help us make sense of the situation and ultimately decide what to do. They were organized by, you name it, individual tourism organizations, tourism associations, businesses, academia, and the public sector as well. And these webinars, what I find is that far from posing critical questions about how to do things from now on and how this could change for the better, most of them, as you can see, focused on recovery, on the tourism industry and tourism businesses, but maybe not the small ones like Sinti, but the tourism industry as a whole, the formal big tourism industry that gets that is international and that is exists here in Ecuador. We also had biosecurity protocols that were also aimed for international businesses. What we have here is another thing that we can find in these destination Twitter and Facebook feeds of destination management organizations. Instead of focusing on destination image recovery, these pages are filled with maybe political image recovery. So these are destination management organization pages, but they are focusing on their leaders and how to recover their image about their image after all that happened and how they are working. So you can see politicians working, many pictures of politicians doing something. Also, well, while tourism is important for the Ecuadorian economy, the president announced recently that the tourism ministry was going to be reduced in functions and absorbed by the Ministry of Production. So that was one of the main measures to cut costs in the public sector. However, they backtracked, and this week we don't know what's going to happen. They seem to keep the tourism ministry, but what we don't know for sure is that the national airline, TAME, well, there's a picture there, and the national railways are being closed. Also, they're closed, and I don't know the word in English, liquidifying, and it means that their assets are going to be sold, and we don't know for sure if they're going to be sold as a whole or separate, or if these companies are going to continue operating in a private way, or they just disappear and we don't have this anymore. This is the railway is a national asset, of course, and is a heritage, cultural heritage. We also know that one of the public businesses for tourism, Immobiliar, is going to be closed, and this is in charge of the management of many tourism attractions in Ecuador, including the Parque Histórico Guayaquil, which is a place for natural and cultural conservation. With this closure, as I said, there's no transparency. The public policy is being made very quickly with no accountability, no transparency, and no information available to the public. So this national and cultural heritage, we don't know what's going to happen with it. Also, 2,000 people has been let go with this decision, and much more than depends on these businesses and these attractions in an informal way. Of course, our national economy needs to be rescued, and we need to do something in the face of the oil crisis. But we also need to be aware that this decision come with socio-cultural and environmental costs, and nobody seems to be talking about this, not even the tourism ministry. So what we also have, there are some policies for aim for businesses. Because of the sanitary emergency, the government completely relaxed labor laws to help businesses not to disappear. And you can suspend payments to your employees, you can not contribute to their social security anymore, reduce their salaries, etc. Also, what we have is a new program for of credits for micro businesses. So what the government is saying is that with all the money we save in the public businesses or the public companies that I presented in the previous slides, we can now have credits to save micro businesses. And then we have conflicting policies. This is, well, you can see here two of our ministries. On the left, we have the Ministry of Interior Affairs, who announced in a press conference last week that all of our national bank holidays are going to be suspended for the rest of the year. And the same week, our tourism minister on the right announced that one of the fundamental pillars of tourism recovery was going to be domestic tourism. How are we going to do domestic tourism if we don't have national holidays anymore? So this leaves the tourism sector in confusion and uncertainty, as Cinti said. Also, another conflicting policy has to do with direct flights to the Galapagos Islands. What happens now is that if you want to go to the Galapagos Islands, one of our key attractions, you have to take a flight either from Quito or Guayaquil. But one of the new measures is that you can take a flight, you will be able to take a flight from anywhere in the world. This is a policy that is very hard with our land-based destinations, such as Quito, Guayaquil, and Cuenca, because when you have to take a flight from Quito or Guayaquil, it means that you visit these places, which is another policy for recovery that has been announced. So there's a conflict. There are conflicting policies between what the president says and what the tourism ministry says. And we had this as well. These were very enlightening for us as academics. When we were in the peak of the crisis, the Destination Management Organization of Guayaquil published this. You can see them in the left. They published this. Well, these things about prayer day. So instead of saying, well, we have a problem, this is how we are going to recover, or these are the policies we are going to make for tourism recovery, they asked us to pray. So it felt almost like if we were left as a tourism sector in the hands of God. and on other things like Mother's Day and things like that. So what I would like to finish with is that we have this policy at the national level, and we have a tourism policy that also at the national level, but at the level of the tourism ministry, and also at the local level. What we can see is that the values and intentions behind this tourism policy making in Ecuador in crisis times are recovery and business as usual, instead of seeking for new business models and the transformation we've been talking about. Also, the other problem we can find is that when the public organizations talk about recovery, they talk about traditional business, when we know that informal businesses are a huge percentage of tourism businesses in Ecuador. So it means that their policies are benefiting only a small portion of tourism. So tourism is not being seen as a whole. So last week, the president did his official report to the nation. He didn't mention tourism even once. What we can also see is relaxation, as we said, of labor laws, reduction of public expenditure that affects tourism assets and tourism attractions directly, credit for businesses, but not for small businesses, as Cindy said. It seems there will be new credits, but we don't know yet. Closure of tourism and recreation sites, and no bank holidays. On the other side, what we have at the national, at the level of the tourism ministry and the destination management organizations level, is that domestic tourism seems to be a key in recovery, but also Jose Gabriel was very clear that this is not enough. We need international tourism to have a full recovery, or to have the external income or the international currency we need now. Also, policies are very oriented to marketing, events, and biosecurity protocols. I would like to finish with this picture. This is the new encebollado. I found this on the internet. This is a kit made by a local entrepreneur of an encebollado that can be sent to your house, complete with instructions of what to do, how to prepare it at home, and your own berry beer. So this is not the same product, of course, and it doesn't have to be. It's a completely new experience. This is a hands-on experience where you prepare this at home and maybe share it with people in your household. Well, what I want to say is that we Ecuadorians are creative, we are resourceful, and we are resilient. We've been in crisis since forever, and we can adapt, and we are used to turmoil and uncertainty. With helpful public policy, we could thrive, and tourism could thrive as well. What we need is more research on how tourism policy is made in critical times, and how these private interests and big companies find their way through power and pressure groups, and how traditionally marginalized groups get even more marginalized in the process. So what we are not seeing public policy for the whole tourism sector. We are seeing public policy for some businesses and formal ones. But we know that we have alternative economies in tourism, and these don't get benefited. Tourism policy and planning needs to be culture aware and adapted to local realities. And we know this now. As academics, we wonder, how are we going to teach public policy and planning to our students? Anyway, just like the encebollado, more than recovery, as Irina Adlerhevic says in his paper, this is an opportunity for transformation or the emergence of new orders out of existing chaos. In tourism, we need a new order that takes into account all of the alternative economies we have in the tourism sector. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Oh, thank you, Carla, so much. Very interesting, very thoughtful to hear all about the problems we are experiencing at the moment in Ecuador under this crisis. And thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Our final, of course, and fourth speaker is Dr. Matthias Peckert. Over to you, Matthias.
Thank you. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can now. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start. The title of my presentation today is Research as a Social Practice in Times of Tourism Crisis. Reflective Notes from Ecuador's COVID Frontlines. So I'm going to try through this presentation to share a reflection, to take a reflexive stance over tourism research and action in times of crisis. That's the one, like the one we've been seeing till now. So we've been seeing action at the macroeconomic level. We've been seeing action at the microeconomic level. We've been seeing action at the policy level. And I'd be interested in action at the academic level. Okay. The second objective of my presentation is reaching out towards the tourism academy. That is to say, part of the developing of knowledge of crisis management pass through this kind of interventions in public space where we can debate, we can exchange ideas. The reflexive stance, taking a step aside and building upon Cinti, Carla, and Jose Gabriel's presentation, I'm going to report and reflect upon a team effort, which started 3 months ago in Ecuador over the following premises. First premises, we did share the feeling that we need to rethink traditional business models, the business as usual, and work more ethically to respond to socio-environmental demands more efficiently. Okay. We also know that businesses like Cinti's business needed to face new demands, new technologies, new paradigms, and set of values at the operational level. A second premise was, as Cinti said before, strengthen individual and collective informed response capacities. This is one of the goals we've set in the first days of the pandemic. The third premise was establishing an ethical and ecological vision of tourism regeneration. We did know that we would experience a very strong appeal to go back to before. This is quite significant that Carla commented that there are certain parts of the Ecuadorian tourism economy which are doing lobbying to get back to the economy of before. So our vision was to try to work this question of how can we transform tourism, how can we make it more close to local communities, more friendly to students, more friendly to small professionals. So that's the philosophy we had when we started this project. Today, reaching out to the Tourism Academy, what does that mean? Our line of work is situated within the process of knowledge production in times of tourism crisis. In that sense, the presentation catches up with a moving train. As Carla said, there is a lot of production, very interesting, of scholars calling for change, and somehow we relate to that. There is a strong consensus. This consensus is emerging among academics, though legitimate questions remain open. How far do these calls go in terms of their social impact and capacity to address tourism crisis realities? This is the first problem. That is to say, we are clear, we agree on the necessity of changing visions, but we not necessarily know until where we can go with that. In that way, could a significant audience beyond the tourism academy be reached? We don't know yet if this kind of message in time of crisis can get to the people we want to talk to. So that's the angle of the presentation, specifically in Ecuador. Okay, trying to build upon what I've just said, there is an implementation gap. Okay, this is quite easy to identify. First, for example, Carla told us that most part of the Ecuadorian tourism economy is informal. We need to speak not only to businesses, traditional ones. We don't need to speak only to local authorities. We also need to speak to these businesses. And this is maybe where the implementation gap is the strongest. This same implementation gap has been problematized elsewhere. It is very often that we hear there is a dichotomy or an opposition between academics and practitioners, research and action, industry insiders and academic as outsiders, real life as opposed to academic life, dreamers as opposed to doers, tangible as opposed to utopians. So this is a very classic form of opposition or expression of the implementation gap. Okay? Yet, till now, little is known about how to reduce this gap. We don't know really how to cut this gap. That's a fact. The other point is that the nature and the scale of researchers' role when it comes to translate diverse and alternative visions of tourism into actions is uncertain. Okay, so I will try I'm starting the presentation with three basic claims. First, research does qualify as a form of actions in time of tourism crisis. Second, this is a dynamic form of action, which remains subject to social, economic, and cultural constraints. Okay? Doing research in time of crisis is not the same as doing research as usual. That's the second claim. The third claim is that this is a situated form of action, one which is subject to the geographies of tourism knowledge production. That is to say, being an academic today in Ecuador is not the same as being an academic today in Europe, for instance. So that's the basic claims we are basing upon our work. Entering into the presentation, I try to make it quite simple. I will explain how we shared concerns and turned it into actions. This was the first step of our work. And the second step being all these actions turned into research and experience-based learning. As my colleagues explained before, the local tourism system is impacted at its core. We truly can say that in Ecuador we may have reached rock bottom as a tourism destination, even though it is too early to know the full nature and impact of the COVID pandemic. But I know that basic parts of the tourism system are very affected. This means working condition, entrepreneurship, access to tourism education, mobility and travel, host-guest relationships, which will be very difficult considering what the city of Guayaquil passed through. Leisure and free time, this is not a guarantee, this is not even a right, because there is more work precarity. Problems in terms of destination image, in terms of governance, in terms of conception of hospitality, and you can understand the gravity of the crisis I'm dealing with, we are dealing with, okay? The crisis works somehow as a catalyzer. the iceberg kind of flipped. Now we know we have a better understanding of the vulnerability of the whole system. What were our concerns where we started working? We voiced these concerns through open questions. As tourism educators, we were asking how much of what we used to teach is now obsolete. To what extent can existing pedagogical contents be recycled or adapted according to the crisis context? In what directions? Or are we going to work with traumatized tourism students? Some might be reluctant to face the other and develop reflexes of social distancing. Is this even compatible with an industry based on services? How to confront racism and regionalism thriving faster than the virus itself? Or are we supposed to work with a growing number of students in situation of poverty and experimenting the digital divide from the wrong side of it? This is our concern as educators. As researchers, what will happen with ongoing research projects? Will research participants still be alive? Is it possible to reach them digitally? Is it even ethical to conduct research considering situations of extreme vulnerability experienced among local communities? Why did the crisis manifest itself with such an intensity in Guayaquil? Shouldn't we be looking at the structural cause behind the crisis? What social needs can our research capacity respond to? How might a COVID and post-COVID research agenda look like? So that was our concerns at the beginning 3 months ago. The only consensus and commitment we had was doing something. So what we've been doing, and I am presenting here a first intent of synthesis of what has been our daily life as researchers and academic for the last 3 months. First of all, we've been documenting the crisis, doing press review, content analysis, fact-checking, interpreting, making sense of the crisis through dialogue and collage, building memories and visual narratives of the crisis. This is the first kind of activity we had. The second one was observing tourism, conducting applied research, descriptive statistic, participant observation. The third one was building a comparison criteria based on researchers' location during the crisis. Ecuador, United States of America, and France. So basically, we've been working from 3 different continents and places because of the crisis. Some of us were trapped far away from their daily life houses. Translating information to Spanish, reviewing, adapting, and adjusting contents, contextualize and situate crisis management knowledge. This is what Cinti was explaining before. We've been doing this work of adaptation of international standards, adaptation and reading, critical readings of academic production about how destination professionals and tourism businesses can lead with this kind of crisis. Next step, we've been doing during all the crises, networking and engaging in collaborative crisis management efforts with local actors. We've been working with the Ministry of Tourism, with local governments, with professional associations. And last but not least, we've been campaigning in social media for the sake of education rights and also for the sake of our jobs. This is a visual representation of the work we've been doing. So you can see the observing tourism, conducting applied research with descriptive statistic of what Jose Gabriel explained to us before. We have the translating information to Spanish, adapting international standards, trying to put standards and norms of actions into context This is through the development of the document that Cinti presented before. Okay. Now in this slide, you can see that we didn't only develop the document. We also engage in networking activities. That is to say, we as Cinti said, also it's very difficult. So we need to pass this document and keep on making it, improving it through a series of interventions with local businesses, local authorities, etc. As Carla showed you, we are making visual narratives and memories of the crisis. Things very strong that we cannot forget, and we cannot see the future if we don't build a memory of what happened. So as Carla explained, the destination organization at local level sent us to pray while we were in the pandemics. Also, things that happened, the director of municipal culture explained that for many years in Guayas, the most ignorant and primitive people of the country came to stop. When I was speaking of racism and regionalism, I was speaking of that. Let's see what these people are saying. For many years, this is in Guayas that the most ignorant and primitive people of the country came to stop. I do not say it in a pejorative way, because not all of them were, but yes, a large majority, so that their living condition could be improved, using the Guayacenses and particularly the Guayaquileños to achieve it. This huge migration of people, extremely ignorant, in their generality, lazy and undisciplined, among which I include the thousands of Venezuelans who settled in our city to live as parasites. What is my point with that? Is that we can develop tourism if authorities have this kind of discourses. Another point is that when the pandemic started, the Guayaquil mayor gives the order to block an humanitarian flight. They just put cars on the way so that the flight couldn't land. So that's things we need to remember and to learn from. I was thinking about campaigns social in media. So we've been at the same time advocating for the sake of education. That is to say, while we were doing this action academic, we had to develop other competencies or other abilities, which was defend tourism research, explain why tourism research is important during the crisis. And this was at national level. Okay, I'm gonna finish with this last slide. So these actions actually turned into research and experience-based learning. Okay, what did we learn? That we can make research during the crisis at different levels. First, which is inner circle of research. We've been working directly with Cinti as an entrepreneur. Experimental circle, we've been working with a tourism business affected by the crisis. Intermediate circle with economics. Intermediate circle those with local authorities, and extended circle with social media in general. So my point is that we are trying to normalize what we were doing during the crisis and use it at grounded theory, that building a theory of how we should research and act as academics during a crisis. This is an emerging thing. This is an emerging project, okay? We'll still learn on the way, but yet we have first lections. We know to discuss constantly reformulate research problems, systematize and document data collection and data analysis mechanisms in times of crisis, design triangulation and validation strategies for research in times of crisis, discuss and work emerging teams, discuss saturation issues, define indicators of observation mechanism in order to evaluate impacts of actions and collaborations, thriving from research in times of crisis, grounded theorizing about tourism research, meaning and practice in times of tourism crisis, report and define research projects. That's the research part of the work we've been doing. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Matthias. Very interesting stuff that you have just presented. Very provocative. Well, let us go now to questions. I've got some questions for you. So I'm going to start for Professor Castillo. Question one, and that comes from Bijay Amatia. He's a Nepali CEO of the two operations. So when we're talking about the domestic market, how big is the market in Ecuador? And can it help to invigorate the stakeholders? This is for you, Jose.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I said, in terms of the GDP, of the national GDP, the tourist sector is around 2%, the direct economic sector, and taking into account the value chain, it should rise to probably 6% of the GDP. Now, it is a tricky question, I would say. The thing is, the tourist sector is built up with a very heterogeneous market with very heterogeneous stakeholders. There are some stakeholders that are integrated in big, I don't know whether this word is used in the tourist sector, but I would say tourist empires in a way, especially related to the Galapagos Islands, for example. There are some very big tourist companies that have almost completely integrated value chain that comes from supplies to the actual services in many different areas of the economic activity. It is a tricky thing. I think for the most part, the majority of the businesses in the tourist sector, as I said before, they are very, very much small and medium sort of firms. Now, I think that this is going to be reinvigorated in a way in this period, at least in the short term, because these tend to be also cheaper services, more accessible in terms of they are local businesses. People can relate more directly to these businesses and even help in a way. It is also the case that as I was mentioning, one of the challenges of a dollarized economy is how to endogenously generate currency, right? And this is going to be true for the whole economy. I think one of the strategies that are going to be, every more now and then they're going to be heard is you have to consume local, you have to consume national products and stuff, right? This is probably the next marketing or the next marketing strategies. They're gonna be focused on the domestic consumption. So I do think this is gonna change. The tourist sector is very, as I said, it's very heterogeneous. So it's difficult to tackle actually what the net effect is going to be, but certainly this is going to be changed probably forever in terms of the business model.
Okay, Jose, I've got another question here for Cinti. Do you think that the academia can help to reunite the small and informal businesses and help them to create a post-crisis scenario? And this question comes from Alex Santillan.
Thank you. And thank you, Alex, for the question. Well, actually, I think that will be perfect for Matias or for Carla, but well, as they made the question to me, I will respond. The academia, actually, the group of research that we have in the career, they are Matias and Carla, they are researching about the informal sector. So it's a way to visualize their reality, and I think, particularly, I think that this is a way to start working with them. And beside this, there are programs that the university has with communities, particularly with Santa Elena communities. There are many projects of vinculation with communities that they're working in training these communities, and I know that those projects keep going on. So I think that that's one of the ways, and that's why the academia is that forum, right? It's one of the objective is to be involved with the community and to contribute somehow with them.
Thank you, Cindy. So I've got one now for you, Carla. And the question comes from a Nepali, I think, Tailendra Akachia. And all hotels are going to close due to this pandemic situation. So some of the government persons want to use it for quarantine purposes. Is that meaningful, or what would be the solution to make sustainable this business?
Well, thank you, Tailendra. Just like in Nepal, in Ecuador, where the hotels were used and are being used for quarantine purposes, and I'm pretty sure that that saved some of these accommodation businesses especially in Quito and Guayaquil, which are the entrance port for international flights. However, and as I said in my presentation, this will only benefit, and I guess there's a similar situation in Nepal, this will only benefit a few businesses that are traditional, formal, and that are in the tourism statistics. What as an academic and a researcher, what I'm worried about is about the sustainability of these very small tourism businesses that are not in the data, in the official data, but we know they're there, and they're a very big percentage of the tourism sector in our country. And there are no policies being made for their sustainability. And lots of families depend on them. So yes, quarantine might help some businesses, yes, like as I guess it helped some businesses in Quito and Guayaquil, but you have to look at which are the main airports in the country, and that means that not all accommodation businesses in the country will be benefited. Just only the ones that have airports and the ones that are formal, probably.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got one here for you, Matthias. Most of the owners of small companies are people without a proper education on business management, and others, when they're performing, hence their inability to react to crises. How do you think these important issues could be resolved? And this comes from Carla Quintero.
Thank you, Carla, for your question. We had a chance with Carla and the team to interview many producers, small producers. and to listen to their lives. So what my point is that when you listen to them, this is not because they had informal education, that they didn't develop abilities. So we are learning a lot from resilience capacities, people's capacity to adapt, people's capacity to self-organize, people's capacity to work in association. So Carla, this is part of the solution. That is to say, this is not why the problem of academic background and access to education is one thing, but people can still organize, people can still learn from experience, and we can see that to a certain point, we can make the bridge with the academy. So we had this experience, very practical, of doing this kind of trainings, for instance, for using social media with person with very basic education. But this was not a problem. This is just an ability that we need to develop as academics. The other thing is that most of the time, these issues can't be resolved if there is no a certain openness from local authorities. Most of the time, the political response has been to make it invisible, or make it responsible for the situation, when this is actually family working and moving the tourism economy. So the second part of the answer, Carla, is that I think we need to resolve these issues first from the political of tourism, by seeing it, by making it visible, by making it normal, because this is normal. This is the major way to get to job in Ecuador when you want to work in tourism. Okay, so this is not, these people are not wrong, we are wrong as academics, and we are wrong as people, or people as simple citizens, to see them as only informals and uneducated people. So this is my answer.
Thank you, Matthias. Now I have a question for all four of you. When do you think it's appropriate to resume tourism activities in Ecuador? I read the airports are expected to resume operations in June. Do you think the timing of this measure right? That's the first part of the question. Regards from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, support to Ecuador. And that comes from Fanny Manor. Okay, can I start with you, Jose?
Okay, so yeah, this is
tricky one.
This is the dilemma, right? I mean, this is because the same dilemma that the tourist sector is facing, it's the same dilemma that the whole economy is facing. As long as we come back to the economic activity, of course, that has some improvements in terms of well-being, because of people get to work, then they get to get some income, and then they get to get enough to live at least on a daily basis. And this is a challenge in countries like ours. But again, the costs that are related to the pandemic are, I think, they are being underrated and in a way they are being underrated in terms of the age equality, I would say. I don't know whether that's the correct term, but what I mean is, of course, people that are on the ages for work, they are the least affected by the pandemic itself in terms of mortality rates and contagion. So people, that are the most vulnerable, they are, older people or people that have some sort of health condition. Now, how to take into account the cost of those lives, it's always a challenge, right? Because whether you, you know, I think of this as a you know, middle-aged family with kids, right? It's kind of whether you do something to feed your children or you basically stay at home and you make sure your parents are not affected, right? It's a difficult dilemma, I would say, in general terms. For the tourist sector in particular, the issue is that the tourist sector is actually the channel of contagion, right? Because what has happened is that because of tourism and international mobility of, you know, human mobility is what actually, you know, has expanded the pandemic in an unprecedented ways, right? You know, we talk about globalization, but it's not the fact that this pandemic has gone across borders through products and merchandise, right? It has happened because of human mobility. Now, this, you know, if it's correct or not, it's really hard to say. I think there are measures that need to be adapted in terms of this new normal that we're all talking about, right? And that implies that businesses that want to reopen will have to adapt to, you know, lower capacity in general terms, biohealth conditions in order to avoid major contagion, and of course, in terms of traveling itself, you're going to have to move to, you know, more safe traveling mechanisms, because you know, just think about in developing countries in public transportation. I mean, you get into a bus and there's no way you are not going to be affected by the whole environment of a full bus with all the people in it, with no distance whatsoever, with no cleaning, on a daily basis, or even on an hourly basis. So airlines, for example, they're going to adapt easier to this because you can actually have some distance between passengers, right? You can clean better those conditions, but still, it's still a risk in general terms. So whether it's correct or not, I wouldn't dare to say. I think there are some risks that we're going to take into account and decide in terms of what the costs are. And as I said, what worries me the most is that we are not taking into account the cost of these lives that are the most vulnerable in this pandemic, because we're more worried about the short term in economic activity.
Okay, thank you very much, Jose.
By the way.
Can I go now to Cindy? Would you like to reply to that question?
Well, just adding something, because I think that Jose, he said some things that I think too. When it will be appropriate? I think that this will depend on when the stakeholders and the companies, they are ready to start receiving safely the tourists. There's a reality that I read the announcement that they will open the airports, and there's some tourist time of tourism that will be still active, like businesses. So there are some people, they're just waiting and they need to travel to that place for business. So or visiting a relative, there's a lot of people that they are just waiting that this just calm down a little bit so they can travel and see their parents or see leisure. That I think that kind of tourist may take more time to recover, but as I said, I think that this will depend on how prepared is the sector to start receiving the tourists. And the protocols that they should apply. I'm concerned because I think that these protocols and changes is something new for at least for Guayaquil. I have seen, I have talking to some entrepreneurs and they had no idea how to start working with that. So if we are not ready now, yeah, I wouldn't say that this is the moment and next week will be the moment. I think that we just hope that people start applying the protocols and making the changes to give a safer product and service to the tourists.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. And Carla, would you like to respond to that question from Fanny?
I would just like, thank you, to highlight something. The Interior Affairs Ministry said we were going to open the international airports on the 1st of June, but our mayor, the local administration said that we weren't. So again, we have these conflicts between local and national policy, and I agree with my colleagues. As long as businesses are ready, but also we need to cooperate between different levels of government for this to happen. Because if we don't even agree on the date, how are we going to agree on biosecurity protocols, on everybody helping tourists? And you know what I mean? It's just a date is difficult for us to be to agree on. So we should be more coordinated before we make such a decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla, for your input. And last, if I can ask Matthias.
Yeah, a lot has been said, but I do think that this depends on what kind of tourism. Really, I do think that the sooner the better. We need to reunite families, because this is still the problem in Ecuador. There is a lot of people who just stayed away from their countries. I guess that some businesses, not in the sense of tourism, but businesses like tourism businesses or business tourism, people need to be able to travel to Ecuador. I think this is fundamental for the local economy, considering that we have an export system which needs to be functional. I wouldn't be so worried from the side of tourists or bringing the coronavirus to Ecuador, because we know that this is a very strong focus of infection. Actually, for instance, if I go today to Ecuador, I have more probability to get COVID than where I come from actually today. So that's things we should be considering. We should consider also the progressivity of the measures. That is to say that why don't we start with family tourism? We have a lot of migrants living in Spain, living in the United States, who needs to visit their family. And this is a kind of tourism that we can manage more easily, because basically people speak Spanish and come with good habits in terms of biosecurity, etc. So this is just something I wanted to share with the group.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Okay, I've got one more question for all four of you. And this is from Professor Carlos Costa from University of Aveiro, Portugal. Okay, don't you think the recovery is going to be much later in the Latin America countries, since the pandemic is arriving later in the Americas? Okay, can I start with you, Jose?
Okay, I'll give a short answer. I would say that yes. I mean, one reason is that, of course, the development of the pandemic was late in Latin America, and that's of course, we have to, follow the whole cycle, right, of the sickness, of the virus. But it's also true that the reason the recovery is going to be slower is because the tools, the policy tools, the economic policy tools, the monetary policy tools that we manage to use in these periods are more restricted. And in countries like in Ecuador, they are basically almost non-existent. And this is an important aspect of Latin American countries. There are some countries, as I said in my presentation, that remarkable exceptions, like Peru, for example, or Colombia, or even Chile. Although Chile, at least in Santiago, things have been getting worse lately. But there are some countries that have been able to respond to this pandemic because they have some fiscal space, they have access to the the international loans through the capital markets. They have strong institutions in a way to intervene in the economy. But for the most part, I would say countries in the Caribbean region, countries like Ecuador, we have our own challenges in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. The response has been very slow and almost inexistent for small and medium firms, and that also affects the time of recovery. And I think the answer is in both parts.
Thank you, Jose. Okay, Cindy, would you like to say something on the?
Yeah, well, something very short. So, I think that this may take time, and the reasons. I think Carla, she already explained some of the reasons, and as Jose said, yeah, there are limitations of budget to react. So, but there are policies that are not well directed for the government. Adding to that, there's the culture of the Ecuadorian people. There are many and the reaction that the private sector in tourism are having now, that it's not as fast as it should be, and the Minister of Tourism, I think that they should start going faster and thinking in the medium or long term. So far, I think that yeah, this may take long time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Carla, would you like to add anything else to this?
Yes, thank you. We in between 1997 and 2007, that was 10 years, we had 8 presidents. And some of them were overthrown. And I say this because we are used to crisis. I think as Ecuadorians and Latin Americans we are used to crisis. However, we've recovered from previous crises because somehow the private sector was a bit more organized than now. So what we can see now is that, as Cindy said, that the private sector is having conflicts among themselves, private sector organizations, tourism organizations, and they are having branches and new organizations because they cannot agree on what to do. So that's a difference with previous crises. Another difference is that the public sector, well, they haven't, when we talk about local governments and national governments, they had never agreed. So this is not new. But maybe this time we have an orientation, tourism orientation, very business oriented. Our main goal for recovering seems to be recovering and not transforming and not looking for new businesses model and innovative ways. So public policy is not looking at what we could do different, and that could impact very strongly our time of recovery this time. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Carla. And Matthias, would you like to contribute? Say anything else?
Yes, just agree with the other panelists that I do share the feeling that crisis is a new normal. So that is to say we are not ready to speak about recuperation. I do feel that we need to see it, to envision recuperation so that it can be happen. And till now there is no input in that sense. So definitely, as my colleagues, I do think that we need to be ready to that the crisis will be for a certain time. There is resilience. People will survive. We will survive, but no, there is no vision of a kind of normality in the short term.
Thank you, Matthias. Very interesting stuff. Okay, I think that was our last question. And it's 5 o'clock and 2 hours you've been at it. So before I close, anyway, I would like to thank everyone who joined today's webinar. I hope that you have enjoyed it as much as we have. Now, the 7th webinar will be on rebuilding tourism, a case study on Thailand. This webinar will take place next Friday, and it will be at 11 a.m. British time. We will send out details shortly. And many thanks to speakers again. It's been lovely meeting you, and thank you so much for your amazing and thought-provoking contributions. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. Okay, thank you to Jose, Cinti, and Carla, and Matthias.
Thank you.
And thank you all once again for joining us. Stay safe and see you next week. Adios.
Adios. Thank you.
Hasta luego. Thank you.